quick. This is the light housekeeping. Actually, this is a little different. So Randy's going to talk for maybe 35 minutes. We have a list of questions we've prepared in conjunction with him. And then we'll go into audience Q&A. So usually with happy hours, which this technically is, we also go into breakout rooms and like pair you guys off with 3 or 4 different other people and have little discussions. But if we don't have time for that, because I think we actually have a lot of content to cover, then what I'll do is talk through the questions with Randy. And then with the last 20 or 25 minutes, actually open the floor for questions from you guys. So actually what you should be doing during the entire presentation is being super active and typing into the chat window any questions that arise as you're listening to Randy talk, and we'll filter through afterwards. And what we like to do, just for the case that we make this into an actual podcast episode, is to have you unmute yourself and speak your question directly. So a little bit about TechBuzz. We are unique insights and takeaways on China headline news that don't always make it into English language coverage. And what that really means is we try to rely on and read and translate and cite Chinese news sources that might be, so we're all secondary coverage, but yeah, we just try to get a different angle that's not always covered in Western press. And Ray, you've seen her photo. Hi, Randy. Okay. But yeah, this is Ray Ma, and here are some of our Twitter handles. All right, cool. Everything you need is on the website. We're going to dive right into the questions. Randy, you good?
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. All right, let me close this and stop sharing my screen. And all right, let's get started. So Randy, you are a Chinese American serial entrepreneur. You found success in China's tech sector. So as we know from the event description, our friends at The Information recently spotlighted inDeco as one of 5 startups bidding to be China's SaaS stars. You just raised $20 million in your Series C, so congratulations.
Yeah.
But
Thanks so much.
Your background is you are a former management consultant, you are an iBank investor or investment banking analyst, so you don't really have enterprise software in your background. So just give us an intro of yourself, your company, how you got to be where you are, how your cross-cultural background has helped you.
Yeah, so a brief introduction. So I was actually born in China, in the city of Xi'an. I moved to the US at the age of 8 and then grew up at Los Angeles. And then for undergrad, I went to Cornell. For undergrad, I studied Econ and China Asia Pacific Studies double major. The China Asia Pacific Studies, which we call CAPS, is sort of an intense Asian studies program focused on China. So we did a semester in DC and semester in Beijing under that program. And so during my university days, so I did banking intern, I did consulting intern, and then after graduation, I ended up deciding to join BCG, the Boston Consulting Group, in their Beijing office, because I thought it was a unique opportunity to be able to sort of get a perspective on China, but from multinational and still safe place. And then after 2.5 years at BCG, I decided to leave and then try out. I founded my first startup called WuSpace, which is one of the top co-working spaces in China. That startup, we founded in 2015, and we subsequently sold it in the beginning of 2018. And then after that, we started inDeco, which is currently one of the top construction tech startups in China right now. And
Awesome.
in terms of, yeah, so I think in terms of enterprise, so we didn't really think we would get into this space. But then when we were doing inDeco, it just sort of became a natural evolution of what we've been trying to do.
All right, that makes sense. Let's take a quick step back to get to know you a little bit better. So it's pretty notable that you sold WuSpace to uCommune, which is the major co-working space player in China. So this is in 2018. What surprised you? What was that experience like? And just tell us about the transaction.
I think it was a very interesting experience. At first, I think there was a major difference that we noticed in China versus Silicon Valley is that the M&A market is actually not very active. So one thing that's really stood out was that not all of our investors actually were on board with us doing this M&A, because in China, most investors actually push for you to go IPO. So I think that was a one thing that we didn't expect. And during the process, what was interesting was that it was relatively fast moving, right? So we ended up selling the company for over $150 million US, and then but which is a pretty large deal. But because we had a previous relationship with UCommune, actually both sides we didn't even hire investment bankers too for advisors, but rather it was just more of sort of us having the discussion with them, setting the terms, and then having the lawyers sort of draft everything out. So I think that might be a little unique compared to a lot of other M&A that happens, but partially because UCommune was already an investor of ours,
Mm-hmm.
so that helped out with the entire process. But in terms of our own thinking, I think the key for any M&A is that trying to figure out the market advantage. And so how we viewed the uh, co-working market in 2017 was that it was going to be a lot more competition going forward. And the key to the market is actually fundraising, which wasn't one of our biggest strengths compared to sort of companies like UCommune or WeWork. So that's why we decided to get out as while we were at a very strong position in the market. So when we combined with UCommune, even though they raised over 30 times more money than we did, we were actually accounts for almost half of their revenue, which is so that's why they were able to give us a pretty high premium in compared to sort of our revenue base. So I think that was it was all about timing. After we sold to them, subsequently there was like 6 other startups in the co-working space that ended up selling to UCommune, and all of them, as time went on, each one got like a worse and worse multiple. So it was even for M&A, I think being first mover is actually pretty important.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Let's move on and talk about how then from the selling of Woo Space to Commune, then you spun out inDeco from Woo Space. Is that correct?
Right, right,
So
right.
yeah, today you're in an interesting situation of selling to co-working spaces, maybe to some of the other folks who were also acquired by UCommune. When you first started or inDeco, what problem did you intend to solve? How did you define the opportunity in the early days?
So in the early days, what we saw was that most of the money that we raised from the investors actually went into sort of construction, right? So design and decoration. And the issue we saw was that there was no good firms that could do both design and decoration. And the ones that could give you a solid design with good decoration were vastly overpriced in the market. And they were not necessarily a good fit for us as co-working space. So in the end, what we ended up doing was we hired a lot of independent designers and then hired a lot of general contractors and had to manage them ourselves during the entire process. But this also led to a lot of issues because none of them would take responsibility. So when the construction site gets delayed, the general contractor blames the designer. And when the effect is not as we expected, the designer blames the general contractor. So there was always sort of these issues that were ongoing. So we thought that there's a unique opportunity in the market to service internet firms that didn't want to spend too much on their design and decoration, but at the same time still cared about sort of the human aspect of what a space should be. And so that's why we started inDeco. And at first, it sort of just served Woo Space as its biggest client, and then developed a lot of examples. And eventually, from that, we moved forward to a lot more companies that we serve. So now we've serviced over 1,000 companies, including some of the biggest internet companies in China, including Meituan, including ByteDance, including Tencent, are all sort of our large customers right now.
Mm-hmm. So actually, let's detour a bit from the questions that we prepared. Being in the real estate industry and serving all of these large tech players, what are some of the things you've observed with COVID?
I think with COVID, with COVID-19, what we saw was that it has actually very minimal effect on the large players, and they're actually even in some ways they're even growing even faster because of COVID, because it's actually helped out a lot of sort of online mobile sector. But in terms of small businesses, it's taken a huge hit right
Mm-hmm.
now. So the share of our business made up by sort of the top customers has actually increased significantly this year compared to years past. just because the top customers, they're still going strong, right? All of their real estate buildups are actually planned like 1 year or 2 years ahead. So, and they haven't made any changes. Also, we do a lot of restaurant chains. And so for restaurant chains, the top restaurant chains in China, they've actually increased their pace of opening up stores because a lot of mom and pop shop have bankrupted. And they have lower rents. So they felt it's actually a unique position to increase their dominance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's on both, on the two sides, it's actually very, very different. On the SME side, it's absolutely terrible, the COVID. But one thing that's different with China and the US is that China has actually, since March, China has actually had a pretty successful reopening, with the only exception of the city of Beijing. Everywhere else, the business is pretty much as usual now. So it's been pretty much recovered.
All right. Well, let's assume that you are pitching or telling the story of inDeco to me today as it stands. What's different about the company compared to a couple years ago? What does it solve? And also, in terms of design, how much of that process does your team actually fully own in-house?
Yeah. So let me answer the second question first. So in terms of design, so we do everything in house. So we have over 70 designers. We have over 20 design researchers trying to research. The key to what inDeco does is that we modularize design. So to make sure that even though every customer sees their design as a unique design, the supply chain behind it is actually standardized. So I think that's the key to building up sort of a scalable business in the design and decorations space. So we have over 3,000 to 4,000 different modules. And so designers use these modules to sort of like playing with Legos, right? So they have different mixes and different combinations. And in the end, so every design looks unique and looks very different. But then the supply chain behind these 3,000 to 4,000 modules is actually 100 different suppliers. And so as we scale, we have an advantage in terms of bulk purchasing. And so our prices actually come down. So that's what we initially set out to do. And then the second phase of what we did at inDeco was actually in terms of we built out our own internal management software. So you can view it as sort of an internal BIM for the design and interior decoration space, because BIM is actually very popularized among construction. So when you're building an entire building, so it's actually used very common. But in terms of the interior space, most of the BIM software out there is actually too complicated, and there's no reason you should use it because it actually decreases the efficiency. So what we ended up doing is creating our own internal system. So from design, we're actually building out design software now as well. So from design to pricing to supply chain management to construction management to financial management. And so to make sure as we scale, so our management costs are actually going down rather than go up, which is the issue in the traditional industry. And so as we've been building this out, we asked ourselves a key question is, who really are our customers, right? So traditionally, when you think about our business, you would think our customers, also that's how we used to think our customers were sort of the firms that used us. For example, like ByteDance will be one of our key customers, right? But as time went on, we realized that may not necessarily be the case, just because on the obvious is that they are our customers, that we have to service them. But the key sort of to service them and building out a product, we always have to use contractors, right? So there's no way we can skip contractors. We actually tried for a year to use workers directly, but we realized there's too many issues, and it's very difficult to manage because there's not a workforce of professional construction workers in China. So you still have to rely on these small contractors. So I think the big change we had from last year to this year is that we're now defining our customers as contractors. So what we're trying to do is enable contractors to better service these customers, the end customers, right? So it's very a service to business to consumer, sort of a S2B2C model that we're trying to do. And so what we're about to launch at the end of this year is we're going to open up our platform for our software. So including design software, including sort of all the management software. And we're going to try to sell it to different design firms. We're going to sell it to different contractor firms. And we're also building a supply chain platform so they can get cheap purchasing as well. So because we feel only in this way can we service more customers overall. I think that's one of the key to what we're trying to do. So I think that's the big change been ongoing, and that's will be ongoing over the next year or so.
It sounds like you're applying software to try to make sense of or consolidate a very really messy industry that has a lot of different
Yeah,
players and is super chaotic, especially in China.
yeah,
Um,
exactly. So I think what we did, so one good thing about how we're building out the software is that we actually do the physical design and construction work right now. So we're expected for our design and construction side of business, we're expected to hit over 100 million US in revenue this year.
mm,
So this part of the business is very strong. But I think aside from the financial numbers, the key to this part of the business is actually allows us to be able to ship our software out even better before we ship it out, right? So you can view it as one of the biggest tests for our software. If we can internally prove that it's increasing efficiency in our own
mm,
workforce, then we can prove that it's a software that works for the business. But if internally anything we push out that doesn't get good feedback, then we just go back to the drawing board and see how we improve it. So
mm,
in terms of sort of the speed we're updating our software, it's actually very, very high compared to traditional SaaS businesses.
mm.
So for us last year in 2019, we typically ship a new feature every week, right? So we updated it 54 times over 2019. This year is a little slower, but we're still aiming to update it over 30 times when new features and just testing things out, just because the feedback loop is so fast. I think that's going to be a key. So as we build out the SaaS part of the business. And so our first SaaS product launch is probably going to be October or November of this year. And the base of that product is actually the automated design software, which we're actually pretty excited about. And so so that would be and once we platformize that, we'll have even more feedback from more potential customers, which will help us able to build out the product even better. So I think that's a very good loop that we have ongoing right now.
So in terms of that loop, it sounds like, and correct me if I'm understanding this a little bit off, but you started off pretty human and sort of offline intensive, so more of a
Yeah.
consultancy, and then you shifted into doing SaaS, and you're just now later this year going to be releasing your first SaaS product. So do you think that that's a reflection of the specific industry because it's construction and all the different players, or is it China?
I think it's part of both, right? So I think in in any complicated offline heavy industry, if you just try to break in with SaaS, it's actually very difficult because you don't really know sort of the offline side of the business. Let me give you an example.
Mhm.
So for a pricing software, right? The pricing software is actually key for if you want to do a financial management software to manage the finances of the business. But for pricing software, the base behind it is actually 4 to 5 thousand different materials, which you need the offline prices for, right? So we spent 2 years building up this database and have been updating ever since because the pricing of all the material changes. And also with scale in our consultancy business or in our traditional design plus build out business, as we increase in scale, we're actually getting lower prices, which we can better reflect sort of what the market price could actually be. So I think that's a key to sort of any offline intensive industry. So you actually have to know the business. But
Mhm.
the part that's unique to China is that in the US, most people in these industries are actually professional workers. So there's a lot of talent who know the business that can come combine with some tech people and can build up the SaaS straight away, right? But in China, so everyone that's in the business, if they have a high school education, it's actually considered a pretty highly educated person in this business. So most of the people in the design and build out space, they don't have the capability to come out with any tech idea. But how they view it is that they view they're just making money, quick money, right? And they don't care about sort of customer retention, all of that. So that's why we had the opportunity to build up the design and build business very quickly as well. But at the same time, we combine the tech aspect. And so right now, so our tech in China is actually the best in the entire industry, while we haven't even released anything yet. And so we've been constantly getting requests for people who wants to buy our technology versus sort of just like us having to actively seek out customers. So I think that's very unique to China because a lot of businesses their education level is just so low. So it's actually very difficult for them uh, to to build out the SaaS part. And so that's the unique combination that we have. But it's been very difficult in the beginning too to do the design and build business just because it's so most of our management team are not the background of design and build, And so we're sort of a consulting, finance, tech background team. And so we actually got on the ground dirty. And so we actually spent 2.5 years not hiring a single tech person, and or a single coder, and just getting our hands dirty and doing all the offline stuff, because I wanted to make sure the team is focused, sort of learning all the details about sort of the offline stuff before we started moving things online. But once we started moving things online, it's been moving super fast.
Mm-hmm. All right, then you're pretty primed to answer the next question, which is, in your experience, to the extent that you can answer this, given you never worked in tech in the US, how does SaaS in China compare to SaaS in the US?
Yeah, so I think it's a huge difference between SaaS in China and SaaS US is that the US market is very mature, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think over the last 10 years in China, so there's a huge surge in terms of mobile internet users. So the whole focus with all of the startups and all of the business in China is how you can capture sort of or enjoy the entire wave of the new mobile internet market. And so anything you do on mobile is actually very easy to make money. But versus where in the US, it's actually been very mature for the markets, or at least population has been relatively flat for the last 30 to 40 years. So most people have been doing is how to increase the efficiency of your business, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about increasing the efficiency of your business, well, there's a sales side, how you can sell better, right? But then most of it is actually the cost control side, how you can use software to contain costs, right? If you can use a software and can lower your headcount by one person, then your savings is close to 50 to 70,000 US minimum, right? Mm-hmm. Probably potentially even higher. But in China, so because everyone has been focusing on how to grow revenue, rather than how to increase efficiency, so most of the cost control side, hasn't been that big of a focus, and that focus has only been coming online, sort of, people are actually aware of the cost control side of the business over the past 2 to 3 years, as the surge in mobile internet users has actually been slowing down. Mm-hmm. So for the SaaS market in China, so if you're trying to do anything related to cost control, it's actually very difficult, because there hasn't been a strong previous sort of a trend of people using cost control software. So any sort of SaaS software that has been successful in China has been on the sales side. You had to become a sales tool. You had to help them generate revenue. That's the approach that works in China right now. And so that's how we think about our business as well. So on the SaaS side, anything we're launching that helps them sort of just to manage more efficiently is probably not going to work. So we're positioning all of our products as something that helps them generate more revenue, right? Mm-hmm. Or helps them lower their prices, which help them increase their customer generation, customer acquisition skills. So I think that's a key difference between China and the US. And the second for China and the US is actually in the venture capital market. So traditional VCs actually doesn't really invest in SaaS or in 2B market, just because the potential returns for 2C products are so much higher and so much faster. But now, so only in the past 2 years, the 2B market has been very popular, just because the cost of acquiring customers in China in the online space has become so high that most 2C players, it's actually very hard to grow a huge 2C player now. So because venture capital has only been around in this market for the last 2 years, then it leads to sort of most of the startups in this space are pretty young. So everyone's just sort of trying to figure out how to grow this market. Even the top player, I think in the SaaS space in China, it's only generates around 100 million US in revenue. And so, and most of the players are generating around 10 to 20 million in revenue. And if you can generate 20 million US in revenue right now, in terms of SaaS, it's considered actually a pretty big SaaS company in China. So it's the market is very infancy right now in China.
Sounds like you guys are actually one of the top players, which makes sense. So we're talking to you. Okay, so going back to your point one about how SaaS is different in China, you are very much it sounds like you're adapting to the business environment, in the sense of you're portraying all of the pros of your software as either cost saving or accelerating sales. So that's an example, it sounds to me, of you adapting to the market. Do you feel like, what percentage of your growth or your future would you identify as you actually growing the market, which you also touched on? And also related to that, is it in any way, do you think, an advantage to being a SaaS company, or is that in the near term future? Like in the US, it used to be, a few small SaaS companies competing against the big firms, and that was an advantage at one point. Is that kind of
Right.
the status right now or no?
It's not really. So I think in China right now, it's you can think of it as like it's like a wild west for the SaaS businesses. There hasn't been large firms, and so there hasn't been software. So it's more of you have to educate the market in terms of why people should use enterprise software, right? So when companies become big, they naturally use stuff like SAP, use Oracle, use their Salesforce, all of that, right? So that's when companies become bigger, right? So for sort of task management, people use Ding or sort of I think ByteDance has a product as well. That's in Chinese called 飞书. So people have been using that. But in terms of specific industries, so for example, construction industry, what software do people use? There hasn't been software aside from design software that people use, right? Is there any new design software they use for the interior space? There hasn't been a software, right? So we're in relatively sort of uncharted territories right now. Sort of how to push this to market, how to make sure people are using it, how to educate the market that they need to use it. I think that's the key sort of challenge that we face right now. So all of the market going forward for the SaaS business is all brand new stuff. And so we wish there's an incumbent that's helping us educate the market already, and we can push a feature that's better than them and we'll ship very fast to disrupt the market. But that's unfortunately not the case. So we're going to have to be spending a lot of effort in terms of educating the market. So that's what we're a huge focus of ours for the next year or so. So even in sort of a lot of our PR, so we changed from talking about sort of what we're doing internally, but rather about how we're trying to change the industry, right? How to try to shape the industry. And so I think a lot of that is sort of trying to help educate the market about the next steps of people trying to or incorporating software in this space.
How are your sales getting done? So do you feel like it's all relationships, or how long is that process? And I know you haven't really started with the formal SaaS product, but in terms of what you observe also in peers.
Right. So so initially it has to be relationship based, right? So what we've been doing, so we're actually pre-launching our sales product for our SaaS product. And so our first SaaS product, we're actually selling to real estate developers. And so it's I think it's partially, I think 30% relation based. So you need to be able to sort of reach them, right? So for them to have the initial meeting, but also sort of you need to solve something that's really pains them, which in China right now is how to help them rent out sort of office spaces faster, because vacancy rates are hovering over 30% in Shanghai, over 40% in Shenzhen, and this trend is actually going to be continuing. So we're trying to help them sort of to, when customers go view the space, having a software that can automatically do design on the spot, so customers can view sort of what the space will look like if we rent it, which will accelerate the sales process. And because we're selling it to real estate developers, and there's only so many buildings in the city, right? So it's actually a very big sort of a key large customer sales strategy. So we identify who are the largest building owners, whether it's PE funds or it's actual real estate developers, and then we find relationships that can introduce us to them, and then we sell them directly, right? So I think that's how we're doing. But then going forward, so once we started launching the design software or starting launching supply chain platform, I think it's more going to be a telemarketing effort. So we'll view a lot of, especially if we're selling to a bunch of small companies, then it's more of online marketing, telemarketing. But then online marketing, it's the issue you face in China is because they might not search enterprise software because there's no market for it before. So either direct marketing or telemarketing is probably a better strategy in China that we've seen versus sort of using a lot of online ads and things like that.
Randy, I think this is going to be my last question, and then Ray, you should jump in, or if other people have questions, type it in the chat, we'll call on you, or honestly, with this number of people, we can probably all unmute and just talk to Randy. Given how difficult this sounds, the fact that you're pushing the market, you're educating the market, you can count on probably one or two hands the number of peers in terms of recurring revenue that are, even at your size. Why do you feel like choosing the enterprise software model is the right one? Like, why do that? And what do you think is going to happen?
Right. We think it's the only way you can actually consolidate the market. Right. So the overall construction market that we're targeting is over 1,000 billion, or 1 trillion USD. Right. So it's a huge market. And so if we're having to still build out all of the spaces by ourselves, once we reach close to a billion revenue, then it's going to be a huge organization that's actually very difficult to manage because there aren't a sense of professional workers or even a sense of professional general contractors. So the best way as we scale is actually to use our software to sort of help the industry become more professional. And if at this point, if we can become the industry standard, then we can assume that everyone's going to be start using it. And if that's the case, then essentially you can view as we don't do the build out space or build out aspect of the business, which is actually the most difficult part. And rather we just supply everything else, right? From sort of design software to management software to in the end, which is a huge upside, we sell materials to all of these firms, right? So if we can become that aspect, then we have a chance to build something that's worth over $10 billion. But if we don't, I think it's probably the upside of the business is at like 1 to 2 billion US. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we'll keep following your story in the news.
Yeah.
Thanks, Randy.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, Ray.
Hi, hey Randy. We have people on the line that hopefully, if you guys can start posting your questions in the chat. I've also been posting explanatory comments as we've been going along. I guess my question would be: so I noticed that in your cap table you have quite a bit of strategic investors versus venture versus quote unquote traditional venture. Is that a result of the fact that you were saying earlier that investors are generally just getting and looking at SaaS for the first time, and so probably not a ton of them are still convinced about the opportunities or haven't gotten their investment theses right, and they're still mostly focused on, from what I can see, a lot of infrastructure and cloud services, and less on what you're working on, sort of industry specific SaaS.
Right. I think in 2018 to 2019, that was definitely the case. Or 2017, 2018, that was definitely the case. What we viewed was that most people didn't understand us because while we talked a lot about the tech side, what we wanted to do, we didn't have a single computer science software engineer. So a lot of people felt we were very traditional. But as we head into 2019, also this year, we see that industry-specific SaaS has been a focus of most of the top VCs. But in terms of how we made up sort of our investor base, so I think there's two aspects. The first aspect is sort of top financial investors, right? I think that's we do have a couple, including sort of Fidelity's, Eight Roads, including sort of Source Code Capital, Gem Fund. These are all top players. But then the other aspect that we've been thinking about building out is sort of, because this business is so traditional, so if we can get some strategic partners, especially in the building material space, it actually significantly helps us as we start to build out sort of our supply chain platform, as we build out sort of our traditional business. So that's why we brought in BASF and Saint-Gobain, so two Fortune 500s that have been focused a lot on the building material space. And so having them on board, it actually helps us to reach from internet companies to traditional large multinationals, because we have a price advantage in terms of the top materials on the market. And so that's what we brought them in. A lot of it's just because it just helps out the business significantly. And they're not and because they're sort of our customers, right? Or sort of where we are their customers because we buy their products. So they don't view us as sort of a huge acquisition target, and they don't have care a lot about sort of the voting rights or necessarily need a board seat. So I think that's the good part about having these strategic partners.
I think we have a question from the audience.
Hey Randy, this is James, also from LA. So my question was, what have you seen to be your biggest internal challenges as you've grown your businesses, and then do you see those as changing from like your first business to now?
Right. Uh, hey, James. Thanks for the question. I think the biggest internal challenge has been talent, especially in our second business. I think the first business, we were still able to find a lot of people from the hotel industry that's done a lot of services. And because the co-working was actually a very hot sector in China for a while, so there was a lot of different players at the same time, sort of recruiting people from other industries and trying to figure out what's the standard for the co-working industry. So if we wanted to sort of acquire talent, there's actually a lot of benchmark firms that we can acquire. But the second business is actually very different. So we're the largest player. I think the second player, they've only raised 2 to 3 million US, versus us, we raised over 30 million US at this point. So there hasn't been, and the traditional talent has been very, very low education level in this industry. And so it's been very difficult for us to sort of build up the talent base. So we tried a lot of different things, from hiring sort of top traditional people, which we realized that didn't really work out, to sort of hiring a lot of very talented people that didn't understand the industry. But then the survival rates of those people are only around 20%, because actually learning about this business is actually pretty difficult as well. And because projects or time spans actually 3 to 4 months, so the feedback loop is very slow as well. So that, I think that was the very difficult. So what we've done this year, so we're investing heavily in terms of educating sort of just very young recent grads. And so we're taking up a lot in terms of our management training program. We're investing a lot sort of our own university, just to make sure sort of, and we end up just recruiting young people and then sort of train them from the step up. So we take a three-year view of training our people in terms of, and so hopefully we become the industry standard. But because we've made these investments, one thing we've realized now is that a lot of traditional firms, when they hire our people, they give sort of a 50% increase in pay, which leads to another issue right now. So we're trying to figure out how we can better retain our people that we train up. So it's overall, so it's just talent. It's been very difficult. Yeah.
Got it. So it sounds like it's migrating from acquisition to sort of internal training, and then now like retention.
Exactly. So I think the loop, every aspect within that loop we can do better. But it's as time, I'm sure we will do better. But it's just been it's been a slow process as we're really sort of doing everything from scratch.
Is that something you typically you always do in house? Do you think about using sort of outside help?
Right. So we actually use a lot of outside consultants in this aspect. So we're actually paying out probably close to $1 million to consultants this year in terms of setting up a lot of these sort of the stuff we're building out the systems that we need to run in house. So that's the only aspect we're investing heavily in terms of consultants, just because we don't really have that experience. I think hiring consultants actually it just gives you a more professional aspect in a shorter time span, which allows you to push everything faster.
Got it. Thanks so much, Randy.
No problem.
All right, Randy, we have another question in the chat from Darren Zhang. He says, on customers, how high is protecting data or IP as a reason for reluctance to use SaaS over keeping things in-house?
Great, thanks for the question. I think for large customers, that might be the case in China. But I would say overall, in terms of at least in the construction industry, it's not that big of an issue. I think especially because most of our potential customers are relatively small. So if we're really thinking about it, so if you're giving them a sales tool, so a tool that helps them generate revenue, they're actually a lot more willing to sort of open up and use your software because it's actually helping them just grow faster, right? But if you're trying to do sort of a cost-cutting tool, and so helping them sort of save people through better, more efficient management, then it's a lot more difficult for them to sort of open up their data. Just because on the cost cutting side, you will need to they will need to put in a lot of data for you to help them manage everything more efficiently. So, but in a sales tool, so a lot of it is like they don't need to put in too much of their data, especially their internal processes. So I think that's a big difference. And so if you're just focusing on the sales tool aspect of it, of the business, then most companies are pretty willing to do it.
So Randy, I'm personally curious, and you guys please keep typing questions in the chat or we're gonna ask our own questions. Since you are such a pioneer, who do you go to for actual business tactical advice? And comment a little bit kind of on your peers as well as other leaders in this space.
Yeah, so I think it's actually very important to have mentors. In I think for any entrepreneur, I think the big difference, another big difference between the VC market in China and the US is that I think US VCs actually focus a lot more on the growth of the entrepreneur versus China. The most VCs are after they invest in you. I mean, you have regular meetups, but it's more about sort of how you're doing as from a company standpoint. And the board of directors mechanism is actually very different in China and the US. So at my first startup, we've only held one board of directors meeting over the 3 years, just because we needed to do an M&A. So that's why we held it. But there's no one that pushes you to sort of have a board meeting. And even for inDeco right now, we've never had a board meeting, right? So I think that's something that's not necessarily good. So we were planning to launch a board meeting, have our first board meeting in July of this year, so this month. But then because of COVID, so it got pushed back. So probably next month will be our first board meeting ever. And so I'm going to try to do it every 3 months. And so during the process of us growing, so I've had different mentors during this period, and it's all people that that's introduced to me by either our investors or sort of just people around, friends around. And so we're moving into SaaS right now. So one of the reasons I want to have the board meeting as well is that we can regularly ask for help for our investors, for them to introduce me to more people within this industry, just because the industry is still relatively young. So there aren't that many players in it. And so there's still a chance for us to talk to sort of top players and sort of just learn about sort of how they think about the industry and what they're trying to do in terms of SaaS. So I think that's something that we do need to get better on.
All right, go ahead. Chloe Lee has a question.
Yes. Okay. Hi, Randy, and thank you for your chat. It's very helpful. And my question is around your competitors for the SaaS product. So when you in your go-to-market, who are the competitors? Are they like on-prem software, or they are not using any tech at all for those construction companies?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chloe. It's actually pretty easy to answer, just because they're not using any tech at all. So there really hasn't been any solutions. I think in terms of us, so there's been a few startups doing sort of supply chain SaaS, sort of just help you purchase stuff for cheaper prices. That has been growing. That's been a huge wave this year. But in terms of the percentage of customers using them, it's still very, very low. So I think for us, it's a very untapped market right now.
Yeah. So then, like this, I think this is probably like this kind of like greenfield that a lot of Chinese SaaS companies face. But at the same time, and I'm curious about the conversion rate, right? Like when you sell to the traditional companies, what's the reaction? And do you feel that they are in a rush to get on board, or they still feel like, oh, this is too early for us, we have enough human capital to churn, that we don't need tech? And what do you see is or what's your sense about the turning point of the industry?
Right. So I think it's the key of how you're framing the product, right? So I think for SaaS, if you're trying to do anything cost cutting in China, it's not going to work out, or it's actually very difficult to sell the value proposition to companies, just because their labor cost is still relatively low. So if you're saving like one person for labor, you're not going to be able to charge that much, just because the cost of labor is not that high, right? So if you're trying to do sort of a position as you're trying to help them grow revenue, then naturally they're interested, right? But we've seen, so in our first product, so everyone we talked to said they're interested, right? But then once we start talking pricing, I think that's the key, right? So so pricing, different people have different views of how much it should be cost. And so I think that's the part that we're testing, going through a trial and error process over the next few months. So but I think overall in terms of strategy wise, so positioning as something that helps them grow revenue, that works really well. And then so in terms of pricing, so if you have the data and the feedback loop, for example, if you help every company grow their revenue by sort of 500,000 RMB, right? Then if you charge 100,000 RMB, it's something that they're very easy to accept. But in the initial stage, when you don't have this data, then it's actually very difficult to price the product.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Randy.
No problem.
All right, go ahead, back to James.
Oh boy. All right. And I'll try not to take up too much space here. Hey Randy, you mentioned that you needed to do everything very manually during those first 2 years. What would you say was the trigger for that you're waiting for before shifting to building the actual product?
I think for us, it was just going through the entire process, right? So the first problem we had to solve, which you just have to solve offline, is how to standardize supply chain. So I think it actually really did take us 2 years to solve this issue. So once we standardized supply chain, we knew it was time that we could start building out sort of online product or sort of internal product to sort of help the management of our own company. And so that's when we started. But then it's been sort of 2 years before, since we built out the first sort of iteration of the product to now when we're trying to launch something to market, just because sort of even internally, we faced a lot of pushback for a lot of our traditional people from using the software. So just pushing to everyone, pushing to all the software, pushing to use the software has actually been pretty difficult as well internally. And so even, but now it's actually been very different just because we've educated our own people. Also, we made the interfaces a lot more intuitive based on their feedback. And so they actually feel that it's a value add to their work so that they use it naturally. And we get a lot of feedback from our people just naturally now, just because they see the value in this. And I think this is the point that we view that we may be ready to go to market with a product right now.
Was that challenging for you as you sort of held yourself back from building product? What did you do to
yeah, so it was super challenging, right? So I think that's the difficult part for any SaaS company, is that sort of how to get feedback on a product, right? Whether your first product is good to use or it's not good to use. Because if it's not good, most companies will just stop using it, and then you just don't have the feedback loop anymore. So the thing we had as an advantage is that, so we do have the traditional part of business. And because we do have the traditional part of business, we actually just forced everyone to use it, even when the product was really bad, right? So we would tell them the KPI is based on using this product and providing feedback. And if they don't, then we're just gonna give them a low KPI, or the people who are just completely resistant, we would just fire them. So it's a pretty high incentive for them to use it. But even then, it was still very difficult. And so I think for the first 6 to 9 months, there was a huge pushback internally over using the software, right, that we've been building out. But as we got their feedback and we sat down with them and asked them why they hated to use it, so we started to know how we can improve. And so I think at the 1 year mark was actually the big turning point where people were actually started thanking us for forcing them to use the software initially, because it became something that they just couldn't work without. And so if we're looking at our efficiencies in terms of revenue generated per person, it's actually increased 3 times over the last 2 years, right? And so, because it's increased so much, so we've actually increased a lot of the bonuses and the pay to all of our people that are still here. So I think that's the key. So, and they start viewing the software as something that helps them make more money. And so they use it frequently and gives us a lot of suggestions to how we can make it even better for them to be able to do more work per person. I think that's that's been the turning point.
Got it. Yeah, it's just keeping your sanity while you're sort of holding off is pretty tough.
Yeah, I think the one good thing was that the senior management team has been very aligned from day one. This is something that we need to do for the future, right? So if we don't do this for the future, we can't scale this business. And so we didn't have a sort of internal disagreements over whether we need to push this or not. It was just over whether how fast we can sort of make it sort of into something everyone wanted to use.
Cool. Thanks so much, Randy.
No problem.
Hi, Randy. Just a question on my side. So just curious as to what sort of sales and CRM tools you guys are using internally today. And maybe to clarify, not just tools that you guys are using, but tools that you are willing to pay for. Because just curious as to, from a sales perspective, are there any interesting companies you see which have a really good sales tool as a proposition? Who do you see as the upcoming Salesforce in China, or is this not a relevant question because the context for China is quite different from the US?
Right. I think it's a very good question. So actually the first software we built out internally was our CRM as sales tool. So it's actually the same, right? So every company cares a lot more about sales versus sort of the cost management. So our first internal tool we built out is actually our CRM and sales, just because there hasn't been anything that works for the construction industry or that works with our entire workflow. So that's something we built out initially. So we didn't really look at the outside spot. Now we're actually internally planning to test Salesforce, just because we want to see sort of how we can improve our internal product. And so, but it's more for just testing to improve us. So for us, so the outside SaaS that we use the most is actually Tableau, in terms of to sort of analyze data more quickly, right? So I think that's a very powerful tool that's very useful. But in terms of SaaS in China, we haven't really been using anyone's products right now. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
No problem.
Actually, let's go to Stephanie.
Sure. I heard you talking about integrating into individual users who have to use it. And I'm just kind of thinking about what kind of service you think you'll need to supply with your product as you ship to external users, particularly onboarding and things like that.
Right. That's a great question. So that's something we've been trying to figure out over the last few months. So I think the key is actually building out a product that has more flexibility than what we have right now. Just because our internal product is actually completely based on sort of how we do business, right? But then not everyone does business in the same way as we do. So so that flexibility is actually a huge key. And so I think in terms of code base, so 50 to 60% we can share between the internal product and the external product. But the external product code base is actually a lot more difficult because it has to be a lot more flexibility. So I think that's the first key part. And second is actually data security issues are actually a lot more relevant once we start going to external, right? So internally, if we get if there's an issue with data security, then it sucks. But then something we can live with, or just something we can fix and we can figure out what to do. But if it's externally, our clients' data gets hacked, then that's a big issue, right? So that could compromise the entire business. So I think that's the second aspect that will be very different between sort of our internal and the external software. Yeah.
All right. I think we're going to end here. Thank you, Randy, for your time. But we have one last question. So it's actually from Ray. She said, what is your biggest lesson or biggest takeaway on SaaS? I would add to that maybe the biggest misconception that the West has about operating in SaaS. Yeah.
I think my biggest lesson is that you really need to take a 10-year view of SaaS, right? Or of any 2B business in China. I think traditionally in China, the fundraising pace. So in terms of my experience as an entrepreneur, I've been an entrepreneur for 5 years. I've raised 9 rounds of capital with 1 M&A exit, right, during this time. So essentially pretty much like every 6 months, you're raising a new round, which is essentially you're just always fundraising. And so I think it's good and bad, right? It's good is that you learn to survive in a competitive environment, but it's bad in terms of the sense that you're how you think about a business is often sort of to the next round, right? So it's we didn't, especially in my first startup, we didn't really have a long-term view of how we want to grow the business. But now, in terms of this startup, and so what we really think about, so a lot of time, what I think about is sort of over the next 7 to 10 years, what aspects of the business we feel that we don't need to change, right? And so the stuff that you won't need to change is the stuff that you need to make continual investment in. So I think that's one of my big lessons, especially when it comes to SaaS, in terms of SaaS. So we've been taking a very slow approach to building out the SaaS product, right? So we spent 4 years before launching a product, and we call ourselves a SaaS startup. So it's really a slow approach, but we do think the slow approach is the right way to go in terms of China. And so I think it's the same for people misconception in China about China. It's the market is very in its infancy in terms of SaaS. So I think anyone investing in it or looking at it has to just don't look at any comparables from the US, because it's very, very different. And so it's just, you just have to be ready for the long haul. But there, I do think there's a breaking point where it's just going to grow exponentially. But whether it's in 2 years, it's next year, or it's 5 years from now, we don't know. So we do. So I think that's the key.
Thanks, Randy. Actually, are you in a hotel room or are you in your office?
Yeah, I'm in a hotel room. Yeah, so I'm on a business trip right now. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
All right. Thanks, Randy.
Bye.
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 Thank you.